Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Kara Cookson. I'm with the Maine Office of the Attorney General. I coordinate the Victim Witness Advocate Program, and I'm joined today by Kelly O'Connor and Katie Condra. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. This is one of our last in a series of virtual foundational trainings for victim service providers in Maine. As I said, these are recorded, so they're available later on if you want to come back or share it with a colleague. I'll be sharing a link later on. And we'll start with Kelly.
Thanks so much, Kara. Hi, folks. I hope you can hear me okay. My name is Kelly O'Connor, as Kara said. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the System Advocacy and Training Coordinator at the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, MCEDV. Prior to my work at MCEDV, I worked for the local Domestic Violence Resource Center in the Mid-Coast area for 3.5, 4 years or so, and did a whole slew of direct service work, and have worked in human rights more broadly throughout previous parts of my career. And I'm really excited to be here with Katie and with Kara, and looking forward to a good conversation.
Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I just realized we're triple alliteration there with Kelly O'Connor, Katie Conrad, Kara Cookson. I like it. My name is Katie Conrad. I work for the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I'm the Equity and Access Coordinator there. So I think a lot about population-specific programming, partnerships, barriers to services, access to services. And prior to being at MICASA, I was the SART program manager at Sexual Assault Response Services of Southern Maine, where I spent a fair amount of time with VWAs in both York and Cumberland County. And before that was a prevention educator at a domestic violence agency. Thanks so much for having us today. It's been a really valuable and fun conversation just between the three of us to talk about how we do our work and how we want to talk to each other about our work. So I'm thrilled for who's here, especially because I know a lot of you will have a lot to contribute to these conversations.
Great. Thank you. Slide. So our learning objectives for today, there are, I should say, so many different kinds of supports and services for victims and survivors of crime in Maine. We'll be focusing in today on the supports and services available for survivors of domestic violence, stalking, and sexual assault. But we're going to look more broadly as well at the different roles of system-based and community-based victim service providers. And we're also going to look at the different confidentiality provisions that apply to those different roles on a broad level. Again, with the goal of helping to develop relationships across roles and develop the skills that are needed to make effective referrals. And in all of that, to be able to explain to victims and survivors that we encounter in the work how this wonderful, big, complex system works. So we're going to start with a survivor story. Kelly.
Thanks, Kara. So in preparation for this recorded training, we were trying to think about ways to articulate the importance of being able to articulate to victim survivors the distinctions between systems advocates and community-based advocates. And I immediately thought about this experience I had when I was working in the Mid-Coast area a few years ago. The victim survivor who had been strangled by her partner and had called our helpline and had made an appointment to come in to our office. And I was working with her one-on-one and talking about what her needs might be and how we might be able to support her in her safety goals and what those looked like. And through the course of the conversation, I broached the topic of a protection from abuse order, and to which she replied, "Oh no, I already have that. The advocate told me that he can't contact me." And I chatted a little bit further with her and sort of clarified, what advocate were you speaking with? And can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by no contact? And turns out that this victim survivor had been informed by a victim witness advocate in the Mid-Coast that the person who had harmed her, the abusive person, had conditions of release, right, as a part of a criminal case that was ongoing. And so it really struck me as a common experience when I was doing direct service advocacy about how many victim survivors sort of get their wires crossed about what are victim witness advocates and what's the criminal process and how that is different from direct service advocates in the community setting, and what a protection from abuse order is in particular. And so I was able to sort of articulate to her, this is what process you're engaging with right now. I'm glad that you're connected with this victim witness advocate. This is a little bit more about what services, we provide as at the Domestic Violence Resource Center. And let me tell you a little bit more about what a protection from abuse order is, so you can decide whether or not that's something that you think is worth pursuing for your own safety. And so I think it just sort of highlighted how often victim survivors get confused about the different processes that are ongoing, whether it's a civil legal matter or a criminal legal matter. I'll be honest, before I started doing this work 5 or 6 years ago, if you would have asked me the difference in sort of the civil legal process and the criminal legal process, I would have been confused in how to articulate that to people. And so I think it's worth noting sort of what the impact of that confusion might be. And I'd like to ask you all, like, what are some of the challenges with that confusion?
Maybe folks have their own stories.
Sure. Does that sound familiar for any of you, based on your current roles? Have you had similar experiences where a victim survivor thought that they were talking to somebody different or another partner?
Becky Winter says yes. Becky's one of the VWAs in Kennebec County, so she's encountered that. Kelly, her counterpart, says yes, I have too. Yeah.
From where I would sit as a sexual assault advocate, it tended to happen most after a criminal case was done. If someone never got connected to an advocate during that criminal case, it would be something like I would be called in for a Department of Corrections safety planning meeting or sentencing. And also sometimes it would be that people did meet an advocate during the criminal process, but never quite clicked with them or didn't connect with them. And then we're trying again at a different point because they just maybe didn't have the bandwidth to introduce someone new into their world during a criminal case. But, or it would be someone who would say, like, I think I worked with someone who was a victim advocate, but then we never quite figure out who it was or what system they were part of or whether they were in the community. And I read the chats.
We've got Lynn saying that victims are often confused about the difference between a PFA and conditions of release or probation. And Sheena says, yes, it happens often. Yeah.
So could anyone speak to the question that Kelly had posed at the beginning? Like, what is that impact? Like, why does it matter? And why hang out in this conversation where we're going to try and really clarify and define those roles?
At Department of Corrections. I found often that victims don't realize the repercussions between the difference of a PFA and conditions of probation. They might think I don't need a PFA because there's conditions of probation. But a PFA might be able to provide more specifics than just conditions of no contact. And I often explain to victims that, a violation of that contact on a probation condition can result in a summons for a violation of probation. A violation of that PFA order can actually be a new criminal charge with new time.
Thank you.
So there's some real safety implications there, right? And some additional sort of rights that a victim survivor is entitled to if they participate in a different process, the civil legal process, for example. I think about so much of the work in the community-based space in particular, but also in the systems-based, is how do we center survivor autonomy and how do we center survivor safety throughout the course of their engagement with you, whether that's the course of a criminal case or long after, if they're working with victim advocates in a community setting. Allison's adding sort of, there can be so many layers, criminal, civil, and then sometimes even campus or military response included as an additional layer of advocacy and accountability. I really appreciate you bringing in those additional pieces, because we really are talking sort of like in the civilian space right now, community-based and systems-based, but those are two other large institutions that have responses embedded in them as well.
Yeah.
Sure. So as we continue this conversation throughout the day, I encourage you all to be thinking about instances in your own work when this confusion has occurred, or when there have been these examples of victim survivors not understanding sort of the differences in a role of a VWA perhaps, and the role of a community-based advocate, because we're going to, again, continue to try to tease out those two roles as we continue, but it would be really helpful for folks to be able to bring forward, whenever it makes sense, examples that you have from your own work, because there's a lot of expertise in this small little Zoom room right now.
So next we're going to think about it, this word advocate, right? And we're going to go back to the beginning for a second and think about the history of advocacy in Maine. We're not going to spend a lot of time going into this, but we put up, these are some of, but certainly not all of, some important dates here in Maine that have had an impact on the services and supports that are available here. And so on my end, on the systems-based end, one of the things that I point to is the victim witness support programs. That legislation was first enacted back in 1987, 3 years after the Federal Victims of Crime Act. And this was legislation that encouraged all of the counties to establish a victim witness support program and hire people to carry it out, to help victim witnesses navigate the criminal justice system. So that's one piece of the puzzle, and one place where this, where the term victim advocate started to originate from. And I'll turn it over to Katie to talk about the community side.
So specifically for domestic violence and sexual assault advocates, our work began in the 70s, very much an consequence of the civil rights movement and consciousness raising and a awareness of gender equity and interpersonal violence, and identifying survivors, gathering together and identifying gaps for safety, protection, and resources, and together creating both services as advocating for system change. And that's something that hasn't changed, is that advocates are both providing services and support and prevention and education, while also identifying things within the system that need to change. And so Spruce Run in the Bangor area is known nationally as being the second shelter to open in the country. Rape crisis helplines that were all volunteer run followed soon after. So did the ban on marital rape in Maine. That's sort of where the timeline goes. And programs continue to open up throughout the 80s. Again, still often very volunteer run. I put a link in the chat for a chapter from a national curriculum called Foundations of Advocacy. It's what we use to train advocates across the state. We're going to be doing sexual assault advocacy, and it's the piece on history of movements and just sort of an even greater context of where this work has been, where it's come from, if you feel curious. Much of our work at this point is funded federally through the Violence Against Women Act. So it was in the 90s that you saw a larger an increase in sort of the infrastructure and formalization of advocacy services. So volunteer run, to having staff, to having programs and standards and state funding. But it was also this time that, due to inherent structural inequalities, that a lot of what was funded early on was led by cis white women. And over the years, there can be more. This is all like a whole other 2 hours, but over the years, women of color advocated for more culturally and community specific funding sources and programming. And so the Violence Against Women Act over the years has broadened their funding offerings. And that's where you get culturally and community specific programming too. But this is the roots of the work here in Maine. And again, we continue to be advocates who are supporting individuals as they navigate these systems, but also working within the systems to change them, to have them be more victim-centered, more trauma-informed, more just.
So when we've been talking about these terms already, the sense of community-based advocates and system-based advocates, and the easy way to think about the difference is to ask, where does this person work? So our community-based advocates, and we'll look, specifically here in Maine, these are folks who work for nonprofit agencies that are centered in the community. So domestic violence resource centers in Maine, the sexual assault support centers, our tribal advocacy centers, and then we have lots of community culturally specific organizations. We've got a couple examples here, like Maine Transnet, which is where Maya works, Disability Rights Maine, Legal Services for the Elderly. And so that's how we think about community-based. Systems-based, if we're asking, is this person systems-based? There are folks who work in governmental systems. So the district attorney victim advocates, folks who work in the Attorney General's office or the U.S. Attorney's office, our Maine DOC victim services team, like we have Lynn Boynton here from Maine DOC, our law enforcement-based folks, like we've got Amy McRae from Bangor PD and also the Penobscot County District Attorney's Office. Yeah, we should add Title IX coordinators would be system-based. Also very exciting, very soon there will be a victim witness advocate in the Penobscot Tribal Court, and that is also system-based in the sense that it's part of a governmental entity. So that's where that person works. Our system-based folks are going to be people who are helping to guide people through the system. These are our guides, our amplifiers, and the other word I use is conduits, passing information from back and forth between victim survivors and decision makers, other decision makers in the system, and amplifiers in the sense of hearing what victim survivors have to say and helping to amplify and echo that through the system where decisions are being made. Systems, as we know, especially our governmental systems, are complicated and they can be inaccessible or undesirable for a whole host of reasons. And so fundamentally, we need systems-based advocates to help make sure that accurate information is provided about what's happening, that people are provided their options for how to proceed and explanations of, like, if I choose this option, these are the possible consequences and how to move through that. And then they're also there to help make referrals back out to community-based advocates. And we know that when we do that, it not just benefits the individual, but it helps to promote accountability and safety within that system. And this happens through, usually it's initiated by the advocate with a letter or a phone call or an email saying, we understand that this has happened to you. This incident is being handled by the system in this particular place in this particular way. So maybe it's being handled, it's being investigated by the law enforcement agency. Maybe it's being prosecuted by the district attorney, or maybe the defendant has been committed to the Department of Corrections. Those are all sort of events that would result in an advocate making that initial outreach to say, just so you know, here's what's going on, and I'm here to support you, and these are some options that you have. System-based advocates also will do either court accompaniment, if we're talking about a prosecution-based advocate, or there may be accompaniment that happens in other ways in other parts of the system. So accompanying someone in a safety planning meeting, potentially in the Department of Corrections, or in other states, Department of Corrections folks might accompany a victim survivor to a parole board hearing or something like that. There's also can be follow-up meetings. The work tends to be focused on addressing process specific events. So it's a little more reactive. You know, this is what's happening in the process. Here's the information that you need. How do you want to move from there? And it can be time limited. So often someone is, a system-based advocate is working with someone from the time the process is initiated, or maybe sometime thereafter, until that part of the process is complete. It can also, though, be initiated by a survivor after that process is complete. So let's say the defendant has been sentenced and convicted. Sometimes a survivor will reach out to the DA's office after the fact and have a specific question or need, or often they need a referral, and to know and understand where that case lives now, and to help making that connection. So that's what systems-based advocacy looks like.
So on the flip side of that, when we think about what does community-based advocacy look like, we were trying to think about ways to articulate sort of what community-based advocates are and what they do. And we came up with option providers and co-problem solvers. And there's some similarities to systems-based advocates in terms of the why. And I would say even expanded a little bit. Kara touched on sort of the importance of accurate information. And I think that so often abusive people control the narrative of victim survivors' lives. And community-based advocates are one of the critical pieces that they provide for victim survivors, providing accurate information about in a confidential way and in a trauma-informed way, so survivors can make informed decisions about what is best and safe for them, and whether or not and how they want to have meaningful and consensual engagement with systems. And ultimately, this process, you know, we hope is helping victim survivors help regain some control over their lives, some stuff, that agency that has been taken away from them by abusive people. Differently from systems advocates, the majority of the ways in which victim survivors become engaged with community-based advocates is they engage directly. It comes from them. Often, I mean that like typically it's initiated by the survivor. Not always, but typically it's through a helpline call, or there is also referrals that do happen where there's an advocate initiated contact. But typically I would say the majority of victim survivors initiate contact or a conversation with an advocate. And this happens in multiple settings. Like I said, through the helpline, in-person consultations, support groups, court or hospital accompaniment also occurs. And Katie will talk a little bit about that in particular when we talk about the sexual assault response support centers. Some other differences too, when we think about when community-based advocate might become involved. Nothing, again, triggers our involvement. Although, as we'll talk about, partner referrals often do. We'll get a referral from a VWA, for example, or from an internal agency referral between a sexual assault response center and a domestic violence resource center. It's not time limited. Victim survivors can work with community-based advocates for as long as they need. And it's 100% voluntary. I think those would be some of the primary differences. And a lot of the time, community-based advocates are really working in a space to try and minimize re-traumatization as much as possible, sort of in this trauma-informed space. And sometimes, victim survivors have been traumatized by various systems, whether that's child welfare, whether that's healthcare, whether that's the criminal legal system. And so a lot of our work is designed to sort of minimize that re-traumatization and provide emotional and socioeconomic safety to the extent that is possible, and help victim survivors sort of navigate those pieces.
So one of our, Kara, did you have something you had unmuted?
Nope.
I didn't. Okay. One of our challenges as advocates is to explain what we do. I think that Kelly did a lovely job before with the who, what, where, and when. And one of the other ways that we illustrate what we do, especially for community partners when we might be in your space doing work, is tell you what it sounds like, what advocates say. And we share this with safes as well, folks who are going to be in their space while they're doing their work. And so what is that really going to look like? We're going to talk later about privilege, but privilege and confidentiality of advocates allows us to be in spaces that other supporters may not be. So in law enforcement interviews, during the prep before the victim impact statement. And so when we're in those spaces with you, one of the things that you can expect is to hear advocates say things like, I believe you, I'm glad you are here. What are you worried about today? Would you like to know more about what that person said? And then I have this sucks on there with an asterisk. One of the things advocates do is also just offer deep empathy and compassion and bearing witness and reflecting back to someone that what they're doing is really hard. And we also try and do so in a way that is authentic to ourselves. And so for me, it's actually, I usually say like, yeah, this is really shitty, because for me to say it any other way would feel less than authentic. So you're also going to see this advocate like show up as a whole person and support in a way that's authentic to them. So not every advocate is going to kind of be like a robot of like affirmative statements, but their own style of offering that support. And we spend a lot of time as community-based advocates learning about boundaries on behalf of our own sustainability, but also mostly to create clarity, consistency, and expectations with people we're working with. And so this is also a way for us to show you that when we're in your space and doing work, we're going to keep to our role. We're going to keep to what we're responsible for. And that's what this looks like. The other thing that you can expect, if you want to do the next, oh, you did it. Oh,
well, and wait a second too, because that's the point where I chime in and say, so many of the things on this slide are things that you would hear a system-based advocate say too.
totally.
You know, so much of the bearing witness and the empathy and the I'm glad you're here and would you like help with that? All of these things are universal. So there's an element of that too.
Yeah. And also like the piece that I hear victim witness advocates say that community-based advocates say is, you know, other people have done this before. You can do this, right? You have the experience of time and having worked with other people to be able to reflect back to someone like, this will probably be okay someday, right? And that's just so, so valuable. All right. And so again, back to keeping really within our role, especially as we do multidisciplinary work, as we work on cases together, is knowing that advocates should never be talking to you without the consent of the survivor. We'll again talk more about this, but both in ethics practice and in compliance practice, we cannot talk to you or anyone else about a survivor without their consent. We are not to provide legal advice to survivors. When I speak about the civil, criminal, legal system, I speak in generalities. And then when it comes to this person's particular case, I want to make sure they're getting information from people who speak about the case or from a lawyer. And as such, we can't share details of the case with other system partners outside that scope of the release. We will never answer questions on behalf of a survivor or answer questions outside of the scope of our role. Never take possession of evidence. That one is a little more referencing forensic evidence collection and being in a room with actual physical evidence for a number of hours. It is something we stay far, far away from. Also, you should never hear them community-based advocates tell survivors what to do or tell other system partners how to do their jobs. One of the really key pieces of having relationships, having multidisciplinary teams, SART teams, high-risk response teams, whatever is in your area, is to be able to have those relationships. So if there's concerns about someone acting outside of their role, that can be addressed respectfully and quickly, because it's important. All right. Going on to some specifics about your community-based advocates and partners and where they live and what they're up to. So the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault has 7 member centers. They are throughout the state. The map on the left includes the outreach offices and where advocates are sitting at any given time. We thought we'd offer you some stats so you can get grounded in sort of what these 7 member centers are up to, how many calls we're getting. Trying to remember, I was like, is that right? And what sort of accompaniment we're doing. I think it's really interesting that a number of people, over 500 people received accompaniment services in 2021, and the lowest number is for prosecution, which we could all have a whole other conversation about why we think that is. And then the highest number is for medical forensic exams. Maine sexual assault support centers have been around since the 80s. And again, they were volunteer run and now they have all grown. They all have prevention education, community education, one-to-one services where we support people as they navigate any system. So that might be working with someone as they are incarcerated and navigating the Department of Corrections for services or a PREA report. It might be supporting someone as they're experiencing harassment at school and explaining the Title IX process along with the institution. It could be working with someone on a civil lawsuit or civil case around their housing or access to education or protection orders. It could also be with people as they make police reports or part of an investigation and do forensic evidence collection. Sexual assault support centers also offer support groups for ongoing healing, a helpline 24 hours a day for survivors and anyone working with them or supporting survivors, and child centers, which I imagine all of you have heard a bit about, but it's a place where multidisciplinary teams work together in collaboration to allegations of child sexual abuse, so that there is one interview, one investigation shared by criminal system and the child protective system. And then I thought I would just share some stats. When we chat a bunch between domestic violence and sexual assault advocates, especially around education and systems, where we say, like, how do we explain how we're different? How do we explain how we're the same? How much does it matter? And so there's 2 pieces of information that I thought you might find interesting. One is that at sexual assault support centers, we work with someone, whether the violence they experienced happened 2 days ago or 20 years ago. And if you look at these numbers for the last 3 years, 20% of our calls are people who experienced violence over 10 years ago, and they're calling for support. They're calling for referrals. They're calling with questions. They're calling because they can't sleep. But it's a lot of people for whom there's not an immediate crisis or crime. And of course, you can see plenty of people do connect within a week to figure out what supports they have, about 40% of people, but just giving a sense of what advocates are doing out there. It's not all crisis response. A lot of it is about supporting people over their lifetime. And similarly, we work an overwhelming amount of time, and people being provided services are children and their families and non-offending caregivers. So about half of our calls and services are about children. And so I think we all bring our own sort of biases and expectations about who's accessing sexual assault services, what that looks like, what advocates are doing. I just thought I would offer these two pieces of information. Any questions about that, about what sexual assault centers are up to, what community-based advocates do at our member centers? Okay, thanks for listening to my stat ramble.
Thanks, Katie. And so similarly, we wanted just to touch on some of the similar work that domestic violence resource centers around the state do, and some of the different work that domestic violence resource centers do compared to the community-based advocates at the support centers. And so also just wanted to look at some stats from 2020. The majority of ways in which, even pre-pandemic, victim survivors engage with the resource centers is through the helpline. That's a big way in which advocates connect and provide opportunity for additional follow-up if needed. In 2020, the DVRCs around the state served just over 12,500 folks. Of those, 612 people received emergency shelter support and services, totaling 32,000, almost 33,000 bed nights. A lot of the folks who were sheltered or received shelter services were children, although the majority of folks that advocates do work with around the state are adults. So one difference in terms of the population of folks that are being served by the DVRCs. Certainly do work with children, but not in the same number, I would think, as the sexual assault support centers. And of those folks that receive services, just under 5,000 receive some form of legal service. That's typically through the protection from abuse order process. Most of that is civil legal, right? So like I said, PFA, or a lot of work goes into supporting victim survivors navigating parental rights and responsibilities, divorce, or other custody related issues, including child welfare. So when we look at sort of the services that are provided, there are 8 domestic violence resource centers around the state, and then the Immigrant Resource Center of Maine is an additional member program of MCEDD and also MICASA, correct, Katie? Yes. And so there's 8 specific domestic violence resource centers around the state. And you can see on this map here sort of where they're all located, that all provide very similar services. I think the one that people think about the most often is emergency shelter services, but interestingly enough, just over 5% of folks that we work with typically utilize that type of service. So it's not the majority of folks, but an important service nonetheless, and one of the distinctions from one of the services that is different, I would say. I already mentioned the legal services and sort of what that looks like. All of the programs have court advocates that can accompany victim survivors through typically the civil legal process, through the protection from abuse order process, or through, like I said, PR&R or divorce. And some of these are legal advocates, as they're called, or court-based advocates, and can accompany through that process. Support groups are also provided for victim survivors. There's other systems, right, that get involved in victim survivors' lives, and that's including child welfare. So we have something called the Child Protective Services Liaison Program, where this is a community-based advocate. Each of the programs has a designated child welfare or CPS liaison that is embedded within each of the child welfare districts, the health districts. They work for the various domestic violence resource centers, but they're there to provide sort of enhanced support and safety planning for victim survivors that are navigating child welfare, as well as consultation and support to the caseworkers that are navigating those DV related cases. Another thing I wanted to note too is the Certified Domestic Violence Intervention Programs, formerly Certified Batter Intervention Programs. These are DOC certified. Most of the, I would say roughly half of the DVRCs house those programs internally, or they monitor them if they don't house them internally. And these are the programs that typically you all would know, where there's a criminal case involved, the court will remand an abuser to attend one of these 48-week programs. It's supposed to disrupt sort of belief systems and behavior change. So these are programs that are monitored by the domestic violence resource centers typically, or they have staff internally that facilitate them. Similarly, all of the programs also provide youth-based, often school-based prevention education and community education. Any questions about that? Okay. So I just wanted to take a quick second to talk about, this is sort of a top line overview of sort of the domestic violence resource centers and the sexual assault support centers and what kind of resources each provide. That's not to say that there isn't poly-victimization that occurs, where you might find victim survivors of domestic abuse and violence that have also experienced sexual violence, or vice versa. And this is to say that there's really no wrong door. MCDV and MICASA member programs work together. They have sort of an MOU, and there's when there's a release of information, which we'll talk about, there's an internal referral process. And so those advocates are really trained to understand and identify, okay, we've gotten this referral and we've got a victim survivor that's working with us around this particular issue. And I also think that they might really benefit from connecting with a sexual assault advocate. And so I'm going to go about making that referral to them. So there's really no wrong door. And that's what we want people to take away from this, is that if you make that referral to an SA program or to a DV program, that's a good thing. And those advocates on the other side of that can really sort out like what additional supports might be needed for that victim survivor and whether that internal referral needs to occur.
And do you mind if I add something? Yeah. And sometimes it might be that within, and maybe some of you on the call have this experience, you're welcome to share it. It could be that your local DVSA and you get together and talk more thoroughly about who to call when, or if you call the helpline and how that works. And we didn't want to speak broadly about how that works because it's different center to center and community to community. I certainly, when I was a SAR advocate, would receive direct emails from the VWA in York County saying, hey, I've got someone who is willing to have you here for the case update. Will you come? And that ended up working for us, and it was great. And it wasn't through the helpline, but we wanted to make sure that those are things you talk with your local center folks about specifically. And it might be really nice to have those conversations ahead of time.
So this is the moment too where it's important to acknowledge that today our three sort of programs have worked together to put this on, and we're focusing on the services that we work with. However, there are so many more coalitions, community-based organizations that we want to consider that are available for folks. And one of them that we had highlighted was Maine Transnet, and we know that Maya is here today. So Maya, if you wanted to share a little bit about your program, that would be great. Having trouble hearing you, Maya.
Oh, wait, can folks hear me okay?
Now we can. Oh, we lost you again.
Can folks hear me okay?
There you are.
Yes.
Okay, and this is the part where I talk a bit about Maine Transnet.
Yes.
Awesome. Just making sure. I just want to make sure I wasn't talking over anybody. And okay, hi friends.
Thanks.
Yeah, Maine Transnet is a statewide advocacy organization that's led by transgender people for transgender people. In my role specifically as the sexual assault program coordinator of Maine Transnet, I coordinate support groups for trans survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. So these groups may be online or in person. Most of our groups are online right now. And I also facilitate a lot of educational opportunities for advocates in Maine, or basically anyone who works within the sexual assault or domestic violence field, about trauma-informed care with trans survivors. And that includes 2 different 4-week statewide trainings during the year, or agency-specific trainings for agencies who ask for said training. And we also work collaboratively with agencies to focus on, like, okay, how can your policies be more gender inclusive? What are some other trans-specific resources we can look into for a specific client that you have? And yeah, that's it.
Great. Thank you for that, Maya.
And I just wanted to point out too a couple of the other programs here. So the Wabanaki Women's Coalition is a joint domestic violence and sexual assault coalition. We're really lucky in the state of Maine. Roughly 50% of the states have tribal specific coalitions. I think 21 was the last I looked. And we're really lucky in Maine to have that. And so the Wabanaki Women's Coalition, they have 5 member programs that primarily serve tribal citizens, although they will work with anyone. And these programs provide almost the same exact services that the domestic violence and sexual assault programs that are members of MICASA and MCEDV provide. And so we want to highlight the good work that they do, and as an important community-based advocate partner. And if you are working with tribal citizens, something to really consider in terms of making that referral to the appropriate support and service for any victim survivor that is a tribal citizen. Again, those programs will work with anybody, but they are culturally specific and designed to work for tribal victims of domestic abuse and violence and sexual assault.
Great. So to round us out, because we've looked at the services that MICASA and MCEDV provide, I just had this slide to talk a little bit about the work of victim witness advocates, and also in a couple of our counties, although less and less, there may be folks who are trial assistants, and that's their title, but they're providing similar work, especially for survivors of property and financial crimes, or negligent or motor vehicle related homicides, as opposed to domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or trafficking. So right now in Maine, there are more than 65 VWAs in actually over 20 county DA offices. And the scope is much broader. Every office has a different way of dividing the docket. Sometimes certain VWAs are working on a particular set of cases, like the domestic and sexual violence cases versus property and financial cases. Or sometimes it's just by alphabet. So one VWA works with half the alphabet and the other VWA works with the other half. I know that's the arrangement for Becky and Kelly, who are on the call today. And then another arrangement is some VWAs divide the work by geography. So in York County, for example, there's VWAs who work with all the victims whose cases are in the Springvale courthouse versus the Biddeford courthouse. So that's just another example. There's also 3 VWAs in the criminal division of the Attorney General's office, which is where I'm technically based, although my work is statewide. And they just work with the surviving families of murder homicides, and then some of the other victim cases, of which there are few, that are prosecuted by our office. So every now and then they might be working with a survivor in I'm thinking of just recently, there's a child sexual assault case that the AG's office took due to a conflict. And so they worked with the surviving family in that case. Their responsibility is primarily to carry out the Maine victim rights law notification provisions, explaining what's going on, providing options. really hearing out and listening to how victim survivors feel about those options. And in particular, whatever accountability is proposed, and serving as a conduit to the prosecutor. So helping to facilitate this flow of information between the victim, survivor, and all of the various decision makers in the process. Often the prosecutor is that first decision maker to decide how the case, how the office wants to advocate for the case to resolve. And there's a lot of advocacy that can happen within the office. One example that I'm thinking of, just recently, I had a VWA call me. She had reached out to a victim. She called a victim to say, this is what's going on in your case. There's going to be a hearing. And the person who picked up the phone it wasn't the voice she was expecting. And this gentleman said, she doesn't want to talk to you. This is over. I thought this case was over. She doesn't want to talk to you. She doesn't want to have anything to do with you. Now, the case, this might sound like, oh, this sounds like domestic violence. The case had been charged as a disorderly conduct. The advocate was a little bit taken aback, and she could hear in the background the voice of the victim, and she was saying, no, I want to talk to her. Let me get on the phone. I want to know what's going on. And there was a little bit of an argument. And so advocacy within the office in that case involved a couple things, knowing that the victim had wanted to talk to her, was frustrated. It meant that knowing that this victim, by the way, had called law enforcement and engaged with law enforcement in the past, she called law enforcement out to the home, but she also had a conversation with the prosecutor to say, did we charge this right? Should we look at whether this is a domestic? Should we have the officer investigate the case further? Because this sounds like a much more serious situation potentially than just a disorderly conduct case, which is a pretty low level misdemeanor. And then there's another piece of the work that's about assessing needs and making referrals, which we've talked about. And also, assessing needs can look like just the logistical needs to help them access the process. And it might be transportation, they can't get to court without a car, or these days it's a lot of helping people use Zoom so that they can attend a court hearing virtually. It looks like making sure that people are working with the court's disability office to make sure that people have the disability accommodations that they need so that they can fully access the process. And it also looks like finding interpreters for the sometimes informal case meetings that can happen within the office, and also just to be able to communicate with the survivor on a regular basis. So those are just some examples of assessing needs, advocating for accommodations where that's what the victim survivor wants in the process, and helping to make referrals and connections in the community. Because this role is really it's a 9 to 5, 5-day-a-week type role, more so than a 24/7 hotline type role. So the next thing we're going to do, and once we wrap up, by the way, just so you all have the roadmap, we'll take a break after this. We're going to do just a brief breakout exercise, and I'm just going to work on getting our group set up while I explain it. I'm going to try to do 2 things at once. Having a little bit of trouble with my software.
There was feedback from the audience that Becky particularly does not feel like she works 9 to 5.
Yeah, no, I know, Becky. The role is envisioned as 9 to 5.
She's like, it's not.
Yeah, I know.
We seem to work all the time, says her counterpart.
Yeah. But you're not somebody who's you are allowed to set boundaries, and it is within the scope of your role to set the boundary that you're not going to take a call at 2 a.m. Whether you do that and whether there are situations that come up where you have to do that are a totally different story. But it's not envisioned that we regularly have availability at 2 a.m. I totally get you. Yeah, God, I'm so sorry. My Zoom software is a little funky right now, and it's not letting me do the breakout.
I don't see breakout rooms as an option either for at the bottom toolbar. I'm just looking.
But what we could do potentially is, especially because we have a smaller group today, instead of doing breakout rooms for this exercise, we could have a conversation with these 2 questions. And what I can do is, there we go. Well, maybe that'll help too. It's not helping me on the software end. So what we'll do is I'm going to actually leave the meeting and come back in and see if that helps reset my Zoom software. And Kelly and Katie, if you want to just facilitate us through this conversation, and then we can take a break. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Sounds good. I'm wondering if anyone who has been in this work a little while, if you have a spiel, if you have a way that you explain the difference between community advocates and what your role is, that you feel like over the years you've honed a little bit and would share it, because I think that's the ask, is how do you explain your current role to a victim survivor in a way that they're going to understand and retain it, relative to community-based advocate? Does anyone want to explain how they do it? Becky, oh, good. Thanks.
I always say to, oh, you're echoing because you're over there. Kelly's beside me and she's making an echo. So I always explain to victims that anything that has to do with divorce, kids, anything that does not pertain to that one instance of that criminal act does not involve me. So if they want an advocate for a PFA or a PFH, or they need an attorney for divorce or children's services or anything to that effect, it's not in my scope of what I do. My job is to walk them through the legal system. My job is to rip the Band-Aid off. Every time they feel that they're healing from what has happened to them, I will call them, I will rip the Band-Aid off and start over again. So I'm not one of the, we're not considered like, you know, nicey hold their hands. I mean, we try to be, obviously, but it doesn't always work that way. But anything outside of that one instance of that criminal, what happened on that night, that morning, that day, does not really have anything to do with us. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah. And it's helpful, like, even by saying divorce and family, as opposed to what I like, civil, legal, blah, blah, blah. It's just so helpful to have those concrete words.
Yeah.
Sure. Does anyone else have things they've tried that worked in describing their role versus community roles? Keywords they use?
It looks like Brian has something they've shared in the chat. I usually just say that it is my role to support them as a victim through the prosecution process, but I try to make it clear that I can try to support them or lead them to someone who can support them with other things. That conduit that Kara was talking about, not just a conduit to internal system, internal like staff, but also external like community-based support.
I'm having trouble even getting out of my Zoom.
No problem. Lynn has another thing that They've added here, I make victims aware up front what services I can and can't provide to them. So that's really trauma informed right there. That sort of transparency about what they can expect. But that I am aware of many other agencies to assist so that I can refer them to. And so I'm curious for those of you that shared, explaining to victim survivors up front, sort of that you can connect them with other services or other external supports. How might you describe the role of a community-based advocate to them? If they ask, what does that mean? What is I heard you say something about caring unlimited, but what is that? What do they do? Anybody want to try and sort of polish off their spiel about being able to describe to a victim survivor what that looks like and what those advocates do and how they differ from you?
I guess I can speak to that a little briefly. So I'm with VAWA MEI, and so we're actually a TA provider. We're not a direct service provider, but oftentimes folks will reach out to us because, VAWA is in our name, and there's a lot of the grants, all the grants we work on. Some of them have, like Justice for Families, things like that. Folks can sometimes think that we are direct service providers, and so very delicately, of course, we have to say that our role is not direct service facing. That we work with OVW for reporting and research and things like that, but we kind of have to explain our role in that respect, and so we kind of have a bit of a like a script, if you will, for if folks kind of call our like TA support line or our website, and we make references to RAIN and other organizations that would be able to provide support and services. And I think for myself and one other person on staff who kind of have this advocate background, it hasn't happened to me yet in this case, but certainly I would be in a position where I would be comfortable talking about MCASA or MTN, for example, if that's what the person calling was inquiring about. But I think a major thing for us, at least in the conversation, is that having to be delicate about saying you're not a direct service provider, but also making sure that you're actually providing support with that as much as you can, to say, you may have found the wrong person now, but let's get you directed to someone who would be better suited to provide that support.
I so appreciate that. Being really, it can be really hard when victim survivors, think that they've contacted somebody for support, or even in the case of a VWA where there is sort of a limited scope in terms of formal support that can be provided, to be able to articulate back, listen, I'm not the right person for this, but I know the person who can support you, or the agency that can provide you with XYZ. And so let's help you get connected to them. And even so, even if you articulate it in that way, it can still be frustrating for a victim survivor. It feels like that they might be passed around, so to speak, from different providers.
I remember someone I worked with in York County, sort of in the line of what, like, it felt like a similar scope of what Becky was talking about, but she used to talk to victims about how, like, when this case is over, I go away. And the benefit of community-based advocates is they will still be there because stuff is still going to come up and you still might need their support. So I want you to be connected with them now, even if you don't feel like you need them now, so that you'll have that ongoing support if you need it. And so I feel like that's how she differentiated as well. And also talked about just really normalized access to advocates, because I think, and we have this conversation with people, safes collecting forensic evidence as well, where we want the consent of a survivor before we enter a room. We want them to know we're going to be there. Like, that's how our services work. We don't want to just be a surprise, or a like non-consensual support person is not a thing. And yet in how you ask the question and how you share the information about what an advocate is might impact whether or not someone can assess whether or not they need that right there. So I know also the VWA used to say, at this point, I usually call an advocate so that they can be here for the conversation about your victim impact statement, for the conversation about your case not moving forward. I know Katie could be here, and so I'll call her if that's all right with you, as opposed to sort of like, would you like an advocate? Just really weaving it into it. This is the point where we connect people with local services. This is the point, because my role is going to end. And so anyway, I just wanted to offer that. I don't know if it resonates with anyone or if that makes sense, but I felt like those two pieces were important as well, to sort of normalize it and know that our work as community-based advocates can be ongoing.
And I would say on the other side of that too, it was often the case where I'd be working with a victim survivor on housing support, on socioeconomic support, trying to identify job opportunities, lots of other things that we are supporting them through. And then it would come up that, there was an ongoing criminal case. And I'd be working with them for a not tied to an ongoing sort of criminal case. And they would, say, I got this call. It's been a long time since this particular thing happened. I've since left the relationship, whatever the situation might be. And I don't really know how to I don't really know, what's going on with the case. It's been a while. And so similarly, right, as a community-based advocate, I'm not going to be dialed into that particular person's ongoing case. And so it would be the case where I'd say, well, I know the victim witness advocate in this county is so-and-so. Maybe we can make that call together to try and get a little bit of information about sort of the status of your case. Or if you can't remember that person's name or whatever it is, this is that person. Like, what does that look like for you? So I would say it also goes that other way as well, where community-based advocates are regularly trying to connect with a victim witness advocate to get accurate information, or to facilitate the victim survivor getting accurate information, particularly when time has passed through, because it was often the case where we'd be working with victim survivors on for lots of support not related necessarily to a criminal case.
100%. So valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else people want to chime in on in this conversation?
Cool.
Okay. What do you think, facilitation team? Should we take our 10-minute break now? Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, I've resumed our recording, and we'll let people trickle back. Hope everyone had a good couple minutes to refresh yourself, deal with emails, whatever you need. And we're just going to go back and wrap up that little bit of conversation around roles and referrals. So Katie, if you want to lead us through this piece.
Sure. I started to reference experience I had making referrals, and I think that Kelly did too, in part because I forgot the slide was here, so I was incorporating it into our last conversation. But I would like to say, what works for you all? What is the best way you go about making a referral to community-based resources? Does it depend on the agency? Does it depend on the relationship? What does it look like when you actually are going to go make that handoff after you've described what your roles are?
Yeah, and I would imagine a bunch of folks on the call have some go-to connections. So you might have more informal ways of making those referrals, and that counts too. And in some ways, those connections are some of the most important. So I'd love to hear from folks too who might want to reflect on what that looks like.
Kara.
Yeah, go ahead, Becky.
I know that like Kelly and I, well, I can speak for myself most of the time. I could speak to Kelly as well. We're pretty close with like the sexual assault crisis and support center advocates. So we'll text them. You know, we'll be like, hey, we got this case. So and so, this is the victim. Here's the number. They're already expecting your call. When it comes to the domestic violence project, most of the time I just pass off the number for them because of the fact that I want them to call if they want to call. I don't, and usually I give them all the information on what they do and who they are and how awesome they are, and pass off the information. And then when I talk to them again, I'll be like, hey, did you ever call them? And if they say no, I'll be like, you know, you really should. And most of the time they will end up reaching out. But as far as the sexual assault, we usually just text one of the advocates and say, this is who it is, this is what we have, and they're expecting a call. So.
Yeah, Katie echoed that piece about they're expecting your call.
Well, and I wanted to emphasize that often works. Again, you have to go to your local folks and set that up. But I just wanted to underscore that if a VWA reaches out with a name and number, then I really am expecting that call. I'm gonna remember what the context is and where the referral came from, and make sure it feels like connected as soon as that person reaches out. I think it's really helpful.
Anyone else want to chime in? We've got a comment in the chat from Casey who says, I haven't worked in a setting to make referrals in the past 6 years. And when I was a children's case manager, I was the only one at the agency and new to the agency at the time. Really common among our VWAs, by the way. So I was doing a lot of investigation on Google and calling around on my own. I didn't have much for interagency connections at all. That can be really hard. And working on that outreach, that's part of the work that Katie and Kelly and I are helping to do, is create opportunities like this one and other training opportunities where, if nothing else, content aside, it's an opportunity to meet other advocates and other people in the field to be able to have those connections and build that awareness about what's out there. Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about referrals. I think that's great. The next piece that we're going to touch on with a little bit of time that we have left is privilege and confidentiality. So we're going to be looking at some laws and ethics and guidelines with the idea that we want you all to be able to be thinking about developing your own best practices to protect confidential information, not to mention sort of agency or office level policies that might exist or might need some fine tuning. And all of this too is to be able to set and meet the expectations that survivors might have around by how we explain confidentiality within our role, because this is a place where, as we're going to talk about, there are some key differences, and it's not good or bad. It's how do we work within those realities. The other thing I'll say too is I've put on a training that's a whole hour and a half just about privilege and confidentiality within the victim witness advocate context. And likewise, I know our community-based partners do trainings on mandated reporter responsibilities and all of the laws that apply to our DVRCs and sexual assault support centers. So this is going to be very high level, really with the idea of creating that mutual understanding and in a big picture way in terms of how confidentiality works, so that again, people have the ability to explain not just how privilege and confidentiality works within their own role, but to explain it in their, as far as their counterpart's role and what their counterpart can and can't do. So I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Kara. So Community-based advocates, both domestic violence and sexual assault advocates, are really governed by two primary standards, if you will. We have our Maine state law, where it describes sort of the privileged communications between victim survivors and DV and SA advocates, and then federal funding regulations through the Violence Against Women Act. So those are the two sort of cornerstones, if you will, of what confidentiality means for victim survivors when they're engaging with services from DV and SA providers. So if you look at Maine statute, it's section 53 in Title 16, 53A and B. This is pulled from 53A, but it's very similar in 53B as well. We talk about sort of the privileged communications with both SA and DV advocates. Essentially, except for instances of mandated reporting, or in the event that an advocate is cooperating under specific circumstances with an investigation, or at the explicit request of the victim survivor, all of the information that is shared with that DV or SA advocate is privileged and confidential and cannot be shared with community partners. Similarly, and I think that the VAWA really articulates this very clearly, and essentially what the Maine statute indicates as well is really when a victim survivor, a DV or SA advocate can only provide information to anyone else, really, except in instances of mandated reporting, when the victim survivor has provided written, informed, and consent, and that consent is time sensitive, this release of information. So it's also, so as I said, it indicates to whom information can be shared to, and what about, and for how long. It's very specific and time sensitive. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice in just a little bit. But Katie, is there anything that you'd want to add, sort of to clarify if there's anything I'm missing?
I added in the chat the link to the Victim Rights Law Center. So they are the national technical assistance provider for at least us at the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault when we think about implementation and practice related to this very specific compliance issue. And so when we need to be trained and brushed up on confidentiality and the role of advocates, this is where they live. So there's just a lot of great information on their website if you're interested, but that written, informed, and time limited piece of paper is key, and advocates are going to take the time to get it done and get it done right. So that's just something to expect in practice.
Thanks, Katie. And the other thing I would just add sort of is, I mean, if you think about the function of DV and SA services, and one of the key differences in really any other system is that you can call a helpline and be completely anonymous. You don't have to provide a birth certificate or a birth date or a social security number or an address, or you can give a different name. And it's uniquely, these services can be uniquely situated in that way to provide truly confidential and anonymous supports, at least through the helpline in particular, which is so different from, I mean, how many times have you had to give your social security number to a healthcare provider or to, birth, or, it's not just the criminal legal system that sort of has processes in place that require personally identifying information about people. And the DD and SA world is very different. I think that's just an important thing to point out, and why these, as a reference for why these very strict confidentiality and privileged communications requirements are in place. It's sort of one of the few spaces where that exists in this way.
And then we just wanted to let folks know that absent statute and compliance, this is all still in line with the practice of advocacy, especially around interpersonal violence and issues of safety. Frankly, we have this like scenario where VAWA was informed by domestic violence and sexual assault advocates who had been in the field for 20 years. So it came around in 94, but people had already been doing the work and saying, no, the level of confidentiality, the practice of survivor-led individual autonomy, trusting survivors to know what they need for themselves needs to be in our compliance and in our standards and in our best practice, because we know that for safety, confidentiality has to be this extraordinary high level. And in order for someone to make truly autonomous, fully informed decisions about their lives, they have to be able to put all the information out on the table without having some sort of triggering some sort of consequence, minus mandated reporting, minus harm to children, dependent or independent adults. So while these are things that we adhere to for compliance reasons, they also are in line with the ethics and policies that live within our agencies and live within the training we get. And similarly, I'll share the chapter of our training around ethics and ethical commitments by advocates, and you'll see sort of a reflection of VAWA and the law in those practices.
Okay, it's my turn. So in the Maine statutes, you saw there's a 53A and a B, and then there's a C, which applies to victim witness advocates. And I think the title of this section is like governmental advocates or something like that. That's the reference that's made. And so I think this is actually a piece that surprises some people. Some people have the assumption that anything you say to a victim witness advocate is like free for all, open, not confidential. And that's not true either. The general rule is that communications between VWAs and victims are protected. There's just a series of exceptions that look a little different, and some of them are the same. So there is the piece around mandated reporting that is the same. And there is the piece around if a court orders the information to be disclosed, that piece is the same. And then there are these pieces that are different. So the VWA can communicate that information or share records or reports to other prosecutors or other prosecuting agencies or to law enforcement. Also as part of an investigation into the victim's cause of death, if they later die or if they're incapacitated, that's another exception. The big exception, and I think the one that most people have the greatest concern about for good reason, is that VWAs are required to disclose, and then the district attorney's office is required to disclose what's called exculpatory evidence. So any information that could be potentially be used to show that the defendant isn't guilty. And this is the piece that causes the most trouble. It's really important that this rule is upheld, because if the defendant is not made aware of information that the prosecutor's office has and that they're aware of, that could show that the defendant isn't guilty, that violates the defendant's constitutional rights to due process, which we're all familiar with. And we've heard about those cases, right, where the prosecutor has withheld key information that the defendant says, look, if only the jury had heard this, I would have been acquitted, right? And then the other piece too is it's part of the prosecutor's ethical responsibility as an attorney as well. So the stakes are really high. Failing to turn over exculpatory evidence could mean that the defendant isn't convicted, and it can mean that the prosecutor gets into ethical trouble as well. So it's a big deal. Now, the best practice and the general rule that we sort of talk about, because the stakes are so high for the prosecutors, it's the prosecutor's responsibility to set the standard and make the decision for what is and isn't exculpatory. And so often what VWAs are doing, and every office has a slightly different practice, is they're often filtering out the information that they're receiving and giving the prosecutor an opportunity to view it and make a decision about what to do with that information. Again, there's slightly different practice within the office, but fundamentally, what's really important when working with victims is making sure that they have a clear understanding of how confidentiality works within this specific role so that they know what to expect. And I've heard VWAs, both here in Maine and my former work in Vermont, sometimes they might even slow someone down. They can tell what someone's about to say. And they say, you know what? I know what you're about to say, and it's really important that you get to share this with somebody. Let me make a referral. Let me help connect you with a confidential advocate in the community who can hear this, and it can't be shared. Because I'm nervous if you share with me what you're about to share with me, that I'm going to have to tell the prosecutor about it, and the prosecutor's going to have to share it with the defendant. Often this comes up with, I think most frequently the exculpatory evidence issue comes up in domestic violence cases, and sometimes even sexual assault cases where the victim wants to do what's called recanting, to say that it didn't happen, whether that's true or not. And so there's a dance there. But again, this is why we emphasize being really clear up front. And some VWAs even put a little message in their email signature to just remind people that not everything is confidential within this role. So now it's time for us to regroup with all of that information and with the little bit of time that we have left. We've shared a lot of we've thrown a lot of information out around the confidentiality and privilege piece. Hearing all of this and knowing that you all work in different roles, our first question is, what are the sources of conflict and frustration? Don't feel like you're calling anybody out. There's a lot of conflict and frustration because of these different roles and how they work. And we've heard about how necessary they are, but that doesn't mean that there aren't issues. Does anyone want to chime in? One thing I'll say that I hear from VWAs is that they report that they're sharing all the information and nobody's giving any information back to them. It feels really frustrating to always be saying this, I've got all this information about what's going on, and can you pass this on to this person that we're both working with? And sometimes that flow of information is only one way. I'm seeing there's a comment in the chat. I'm just not able to pull it up because my software is slow today.
This is Casey. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me, but okay, cool. When I was a BHP and a case manager, I only had my bachelor's degree, and I kept feeling really frustrated that it didn't seem like anyone had time or energy to train me. And so I would just have to Google everything to learn. And I don't feel like that's very fair to the clients I was serving. Like I had a few clients who would get frustrated with me for thinking I had new information for them. They were like, yeah, we hear that like every time we talk to somebody new, and that's not new information. And like, honestly, I'm not really sure why you only just figured that out. We learned that 5 years ago. And now that I have my master's degree, I think like going into the field, I would come across the same issues because in the generalist USM program, it's generalist. And so like, you don't really get to learn the ins and outs and like how to connect with other agencies. And I feel like there could be so much improvement on like interagency training and collaboration, just from like the new kid perspective.
Thank you so much for that reflection. That's great. Anyone else want to chime in on that? I think along those lines too, Casey, one of the things I hear a lot from the field is, you know, I try to build relationships with my counterparts and there's so much turnover. As soon as I think I have it figured out what's going on over there, and it could be either side of the over there, there's someone new. Yeah. Anyone else want to chime in? Or we have the second question too, if we want to take the sunny side of this, which is how can we get creative to support best outcomes?
I think as a way to support outcomes, I think we really have to, support and nurture each other in this field. I think there's a reason that there are a great deal of folks, not myself, I'm still relatively new to the field, who have been in the field for a long time. And so I think it's important that, newer folks are connected with folks who have been in this for a long time, but also thinking about ways of providing support for folks who are working with really, really difficult situations for their day-to-day lives, for their jobs. And I think it also kind of has to be said, kind of also talking from my social work perspective, that a lot of folks in this field also have their own trauma histories, and being able to kind of sit with the fact that people can get triggered through vicarious trauma, or people can get triggered because they can be reminded of, their own histories, and how we really need to support each other and support the folks who we work with and ourselves as well. Because if we aren't okay, then we're going to have a really hard time, best serving the client, victim, survivor. We won't have the best time necessarily remembering to make those really split-second kind of decisions of, like you said, Carol, like, let's wait off on saying that. Let's maybe get you to a different advocate or resource for that. And I think part of that creativity to support best outcomes has to be with nurturing and supporting our, mental, behavioral, spiritual health in this field, because it is very taxing.
Yeah, that's a great comment, a really great thought. Thank you for that too. I mean, the other thing that I'm sort of hearing you saying in this is assuming best intentions of each other too. And so sometimes when we see, when we see our counterpart acting in a certain way, doing something, a certain thing that's frustrating, I think it's also important to remember just how many survivors there are in the work, and how our trauma can kind of come out sideways sometimes. And really just holding space for that and compassion for that. And knowing that everyone's doing their best within their role, within the limits of what they're able to do. Any other creative ideas, thoughts, how to make this work? Katie or Kelly, any closing thoughts?
I mean, I'm thinking about like how the big picture sustains us, like having a relationship, understanding each other's roles, even just being in the same place together enough to hear and like each other's values sort of bubble to the surface. Like even hearing Becky talk about ripping off the Band-Aid, like tells me she she gets like trauma-informed services and work, and that we share that, and that we bring those values, both of us, to the people we're working with, even if it's in different roles, and how you can only get that information if you are actually working together. But I also think of just like the really small logistical thing is recognizing like I need to get a release to talk to someone, and that can be really frustrating because I'm less nimble, but we'll be really clear on, I will give this person this information. I will pass it along to them. And if you don't hear back from me by the end of the day, I think we can assume they're not ready to engage. These sort of like built-in extra conversations to sort of serve logistically day to day to better support each other in our roles. So I think it's what Sammy said. It's like big picture support and shared values, and also this just like very paying attention to the details of conversations and information with each other, I think can really help in the long term too.
Becky, did you want to chime in? No? Okay. Hi, Kelly.
Okay. I just wanted to acknowledge, this is it's 10 o'clock on a Tuesday. Yes, it's a Tuesday, and you've got folks showing up here to be in conversation, even though this is going to be a recorded session. I'm just so grateful for those that have wanted to engage here today to connect with one another on this topic, and, to echo both what Katie was saying and Kara, how we pay attention to details, but also have this overarching, goal, like acknowledging, it's important to acknowledge negative impact of the way that processes work or don't work for victim survivors, but also to come at it from the understanding that to assume positive intent and how important that is, and to be able to connect with one another when there are challenges, and how do we go about that in ethical communication with one another to say, hey, this is something that happened this last time, how can we avoid this happening in the future, and coming at that from a place of curiosity and genuine joint desire for best possible outcomes for victim survivors, and whatever that looks like for them. And, I think an important question that we often ask in the DV field in particular is, what does justice look like for you? Because it may not look the same across the board. And I think that happens even for victim survivors that are navigating the criminal legal system, always asking, what would it look like for you? What would justice look like for you today? And in the future. And I think that's where can be that really wonderful marriage between both our systems advocates and our community-based advocates to find out what justice looks like for folks in the long term. And how that, I think, is constantly evolving and is never one-dimensional, never one size fits all.
Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts from anyone? Love to hear from you. Otherwise, I'm going to send you off on this early fall day. And thank you so much for coming and joining us. And next week, by the way, October 5th, we're going to do a redo on connecting oppressions with Kelly, and that will conclude our foundational training series for this year, which is really exciting. It's been a big piece of work, and many thanks to Katie and Kelly for being such great partners and helping to make this happen. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Nice to see you all.
Yeah, it's great.